Navigating the legal world can feel overwhelming, but it doesn't have to be. The Indiana Lawyer Podcast is here to help you understand the laws impacting your life, work, and community. Whether you're a legal professional, a business owner, or someone who wants to know how Indiana law shapes the world around you, this podcast is for you. Hosted by Alexa Shrake, a passionate legal reporter, we're here to bring you clarity and insights like no one else can. This podcast is brought to you by Taft, today's modern law firm.
Daylight savings is everyone's favorite debate each fall and spring. As we near the time to turn the clocks, former Indiana Supreme Court Chief Justice Randall Shepard talks about when there used to be 2 clocks in the State House. Listen to find out how much has changed in the 20 years the Hoosier State has had daylight savings due to the efforts made by former Governor Mitch Daniels. But before we get into it, let's hear from our sponsor, Taft.
Taft, today's modern law firm. At Taft, we cultivate a highly respectful, transparent workplace that fosters creativity, teamwork, inclusion, and diversity. We couple our culture with a client-first approach, rewarding lawyers who understand their clients' goals and work to deliver success. Taft, the modern law firm. To learn more, visit taftlaw.com.
Welcome to the Indiana Lawyer Podcast. I'm your host, Alexa Shrake. I'm here in our Monument Circle studio with Justice Randall Shepard. With daylight savings coming up, we are going to dive into the history of time in Indiana and how it is a legal issue. So to start, Randall, can you explain to me a little bit how something like time can be a legal issue?
It does seem a little unusual, doesn't it? But there are other things in our lives that also don't seem law-related. But for instance, we have signs for speed limits. How is that legal? I mean, the reason it's legal, the reason we have speed limit lines is for safety and to keep people from going 95, hopefully, keep people from going 95 miles an hour in a 30-mile zone and hitting something or hitting somebody else. There are a lot of aspects of our lives in which the time of day really matters, like when do we have doctor's appointments, or when are we due at work. And you can do a little of that, you can solve a little of that just by having people sort of agree on what the time actually should be or what it is. But you don't really solve that issue unless you've got a law that says, here's what everybody's time is going to be in your zone. And so that's how it becomes legal. And the Congress has passed over time laws, and so is the Indiana legislature, but it's mostly a federal thing because it covers all the states. The idea of time zones, the place where it really became difficult, a little bit like speeding zones, was when railroads became so ubiquitous and we didn't have airplanes. This would be late 1800s. Didn't have airplanes, and you got from one place to another by train. And if you took a train from Philadelphia to Fort Wayne, but you had to switch in Columbus, Ohio to get that done, how do you know you're going to be there in time? And how do you know what time it is in Columbus, Ohio, for you to get off the train and move to a different train? Maybe they're using a different time. So the reason that the country first got started seriously regulating time by law was originally it was trains. But of course, today, a lot of things we do, like what time is our appointment on YouTube? Or when's our Zoom call? What if everybody made up their own minds about what time that meant? They'll tell us it's 2 o'clock, but 2 o'clock where? And so that's how it becomes a legal issue.
Mm-hmm. Going into a little bit of the background of time in Indiana, we have part of the state that's in Central Time Zone, and then the majority of the state is in Eastern Time Zone. There have been efforts to change that. Can you tell me a little bit about those efforts?
There is actually a way to change it, and it has happened. The operation we've been living under for the last 50 years is called the Uniform Time Act of 1967. at that moment, there had been federal statutes about time, particularly during the two world wars, when it was important for the military as well as the railroads to know what time it was going to be in a given place on a given day. The long-standing act, now a little more than 50 years, 55 years, was the Uniform Time Act of 1967. I got to know a little about that because I once worked in the place where the enforcement occurs, which is the U.S. Department of Transportation, of course, where it sort of got started on time. But when I graduated law school, my very first job was working at where Secretary Buttigieg just departed, and they're the ones who enforce the Time Act with respect to everything except daylight savings, where the states individually can make their choices. I'll talk about that too if you want me later, maybe. The Department of Transportation actually draws the lines. Here's the line between Eastern and Central, Central and Mountain. And they will hold hearings and take comments and so on. They did. This all happened quite a while back. But if you want to change it, that's who you go to. And that happened in Indiana, I think actually in two places. The one I remember is in southwestern Indiana. So most of Indiana is in the eastern zone except for Gary and and Evansville. And the reason they've been there, I think, lined up is because they have a lot, particularly Gary, of course, a lot of connection to Chicago. And if you want to change it, you go to them. And there was a time it'd be the late 70s, when people in Pike County seat is Petersburg, it's about 50 miles from Evansville. They'd been in the central zone when the lines were first set up, but there was a lot of interest locally in moving to the Eastern time zone. So the U.S. Department of Transportation, I'm not the one who got this assignment, though I worked with the people who enforced the Time Act when I was at DOT, sent out an investigator to come and talk to the county government and talk to people in the grocery stores. And what do you think about the time here in Petersburg? And does it really need to be changed or not? And they reached that investigator was somebody I knew, reached the conclusion that, yeah, probably if the locals wanted to be in Eastern, that was probably just fine. So they recommended to the secretary that Pike County be moved, and it moved to the Eastern zone instead of the Central zone. So that's still in the law as far as I know, but it's quite rare. I think there might have been one county in northwest Indiana that changed at some point, but mostly the reason those two places are in the Central zone is because of their connection to Chicago in commerce and life in general. Gary and Hammond are a lot closer to Chicago than they are to Indianapolis or Fort Wayne, and it makes a lot of sense. Evansville could easily be in the Eastern zone, but it too has always felt a connection to Chicago. And there's a lot of space in southeastern Illinois that looks at Evansville as sort of its regional city. And so the odds are that has pretty much stayed the same as it was from the very beginning. But of course, the rule always was that the states got to decide about daylight savings, and forever and ever. I don't think that Alaska and Hawaii do daylight savings, but every state otherwise, other than Indiana and Arizona, were the only two continental states that decided they wouldn't go on daylight time. And that created a lot of issues now and then, time after time. There was this time, I think we haven't covered this, about official time and local time. I told you about it earlier. There was a time when Indiana didn't want to go on local time. They didn't want to go on daylight time. The whole state had to do it or not do it. What that meant was that in certain times of the year, for example, fast fall forward, in the fall, Chicago and Gary would both be on Central Standard Time, and they would shift, or at least Chicago would shift to Central Daylight, which means they'd add an hour. Gary couldn't do that because Indiana hadn't adopted daylight savings time. Chicago and Indianapolis would be on the same time, and Fort Wayne for half a year, but not Gary. Gary would be stuck not with the same time as Chicago, but the same time as Denver. That's when I came into the State House one time, and there were these two clocks up on the wall in a place where everybody could see them. And they had different time on them. And one of them said, official time. And the other one said, local time, meaning, what are we actually doing here in this area? And so the Congress finally decided that was a problem, and they changed the law so that a state could decide that part of it would do daylight savings, but not all of it if you were in two time zones. Finally, Evansville would be always on the same time as Chicago, Central Daylight, Central Standard. And that meant half a year it was the same time in Evansville as it was in Indy, and the other half it wasn't. And even as somebody who grew up in Evansville, every now and then I'd forget. And see, what time is it in Evansville? And I'd have to recalculate, when do I need to leave here in order to get to a 9 a.m. meeting? And it was bizarre. So it was the statute finally changed that you could follow the time zones. And if you're part of a state, like the eastern part of Indiana could stay on, but because Indiana still wouldn't adopt daylight savings. And that changed with Mitch Daniels.
Mm-hmm. That was in 2005?
2005. Mm-hmm. Now, the reason I remember thinking this was an economic issue. Now, when we hear about daylight savings, we talk more about, does this really mean energy savings or not, is one of the issues that's most commonly spoken about. That idea, by the way, that question goes all the way back to Benjamin Franklin, who wondered whether changing the clocks would help save energy, whatever energy meant in those days, coal furnaces. But I remember reading a story when the legislature because the legislature had to say, let's adopt daylight savings or not. And they had always said, no, we'll stick with Eastern Standard year round. But I remember reading a story by somebody who had moved a business that had moved to Indiana. It was a freight trucking company that took things from Cincinnati to South Bend or Cleveland to Terre Haute or someplace like that. And the owner of the business said, we have such a hard time. We're supposed to be there on a given schedule. But he said, we have such a hard time calculating what time it will really be in South Bend on the day this truck is going, as opposed to last spring. He said, if I had to do it over, I probably wouldn't move my business to Indiana because it costs me money. We get it wrong every now and then, and we end up with a truck that spends an hour sitting in a parking lot someplace because the place we were supposed to go isn't open yet, that kind of stuff. So Governor Daniels, and it was a bit of a fight in 2005, but it was Governor Daniels who said, let's all do it or not do it, even though the federal law, the Uniform Time Act, had later said, okay, Evansville and Gary can do daylight if Indiana says they can. So it's been we're talking all the way from railroads in 1885 or earlier, down to the current day where it is, of course, parts of it at least, still under debate.
Mm-hmm. There have been maybe talks about wanting the whole state to be on either Eastern or Central Time. Do you think that will ever change?
I think it could change because, for heaven's sakes, isn't this one of our favorite topics? We debate it over the kitchen table and out in public every now and then. There's a legislative motion to change, and that has happened. If you look back at this history, that has gone on every 5 or 10 years ever since the end of the Civil War and the beginning of railroads. And I guess railroads maybe a little after the Civil War. I think it's certainly possible. I think the thing that agitated people the most was having to. I think daylight savings time is more agitating to people than where the line runs between Central and Eastern. And my impression is that most people are comfortable with being most of Indiana and being in the Eastern time zone, and that I could see Evansville changing. Maybe I can't. I would expect that Gary and Hammond would always stay because of their proximity to Chicago. Would want to stay in the Central Zone, and my impression is that Evansville is also pretty comfortable with that. There's still arguments again about daylight savings, but in terms of which zone, I think most people in Indiana are sort of at rest on whether we ought to be on the same time zone as Omaha or New York.
Mm-hmm.
Right on the edge, after all.
Do you have a preference on Eastern or Central
I
time
knew you were
zone?
going to ask me that. I think we're slightly better off economically being aligned with the urban and industrial parts, the Eastern Zone. I spent a lot of time in the Central Zone. I grew up in Evansville, and before that, we lived in Chicago. So I know about Central Time. I'm actually comfortable with where we are now. If the question was, were we going to all go to the Eastern or all Central? Hard for me to see us being all Central.
Mm-hmm.
And I could see us going all Eastern, but I don't think. I think that people have gotten used to it enough so that there's not a lot of agitation to go that far. And that's where I come out. I don't have a strong knock on the table all the time, but it's be okay with me.
I interned briefly down in Evansville, so I lived down there for a while.
Oh, yeah.
And I liked Central Time Zone.
Did you?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
I enjoyed it.
Yeah. What did you do?
I worked at the Courier and Press down in Evansville,
Oh, yeah.
the newspaper down there.
I read it every day. I subscribe to the Courier and Press, and it's a tough time for printed newspapers.
Mm-hmm.
But the Courier and Press does when I was growing up in Evansville, there were actually 3 newspapers. The Courier and the Press were separate newspapers. The Press was the afternoon, just like the Indianapolis News. It went away, and then there was a separate staff of people whose job was to prepare the Sunday paper, and it actually had different ownership, I think. Yeah, I think people have sort of come to rest. I sort of liked the Central Zone. Every now and then, back in those days when we sometimes went on daylight and sometimes didn't, I'd occasionally mess up and I'd be too early or too late. Mm-hmm. Having it all stay the same statewide, you know we moved or you know we haven't. That I think that was a great step forward for. We can thank Mitch Daniels for that.
Yeah, that's been 20 years now.
Yeah. Oh, I hadn't thought about it. That is quite a while. Uh-huh. So, hallelujah. And the daylight savings, that's a whole nother topic. As I say, that went back all the way to Benjamin Franklin, for heaven's sakes. And my wife dislikes it a lot because it means, of course, twice a year we have to go all the way around the house and start changing clocks. And it is sort of a pain to have to go around and do that twice a year. I agree with her on that point. And I don't know where I come out on whether this actually does save us energy or not. Ben Franklin thought so, but that was a different world. And we didn't have bills on the legislature to help create nuclear power plants. So who knows whether that saves energy or doesn't. I don't know the answer. So I'll let elected officials do that for us, from my point of view.
Absolutely.
I'm pretty comfortable with where Indiana is right now. I wouldn't join in a protest march if we changed it. But I think for where Indiana is and what our economy is like, I think this is pretty good. We're in pretty good position. I don't object to these debates, but I think it's not as important as some other things that we're trying to get done, like education and tax rates and things of that sort. It is sort of fun to think that the country still focuses so much on its time and time zones and so on. It's good fun. I don't know what 10-year-olds think about that, but it seems every couple of years we have a big debate. That's okay with me. I sort of like it.
Yeah. Where you mentioned you wouldn't join a protest. Were there protests previously on this sort of topic?
Oh, I think so. Yeah, because you'd get a change or the zone. It was particularly true back in that moment in the summers when part of this, all of a sudden we'd move in effect, move into the central zone because we'd be with Chicago and not with New York. So even though we didn't have to change clocks, we had to change thinking about what time is it again? And well, I guess I know, but what time is it in Cleveland? I have to stop and think about that. These were not huge knock 'em down fistfights on the grounds of the State House. But yeah, it was something people willing to have an argument about.
Well, excellent.
God bless America.
That'll do for this week's interview. Randall, thank you again for coming in and joining me today. To our listeners, head over to theindianalawyer.com to read more legal news. Until next time, you can listen to our past episodes wherever you get your podcasts.